Hello, my name is Erin Tillman, an Associate Director at the Hoover Institution, and we'd like to welcome you to today's webinar organized by the Hoover Institution Center for Revitalizing American Institutions, also known as RAI. Today's session will consist of brief opening remarks from our panelists and a facilitated discussion with our moderator, followed by a period where our panelists will respond to questions from audience members. To submit a question, please use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will do our best to respond to as many questions as possible. And a recording of this webinar will be available at hoover.org/RAI within the next few days. RAI operates as the Hoover Institution's first ever center and is a testament to one of our founding principles, ideas advancing freedom. The center was established to study the reasons behind the crisis in trust facing American institutions, analyze how they are operating in practice, and consider policy recommendations to rebuild trust and increase their effectiveness. RAI works with and supports Hoover Fellows, as well as our faculty, practitioners, and policymakers from across the country to pursue evidence-based reforms that impact trust and efficacy in a wide range of American institutions. Today is the final webinar in our 2024-2025 Reimagining American Institutions series. We'd cover topics related to executive transitions, trust in elections and polling, the climate for conservative students at college campuses, and last week we explored how restrictions on speech in other countries impact Americans' right to free expression. Today our conversation turns to the role of the academy, and particularly those engaged in teaching applied history and educating future leaders. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Stephen Kotkin. Stephen is the Klein-Heinz Fellow at the Hoover Institution, as well as a Senior Fellow at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He's also the Berkman Professor in History and International Affairs Emeritus at the Princeton School for Public Policy and International Affairs, where he taught for 33 years. He earned his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, and has been conducting research at the Hoover Institution Library and Archives for more than 3 decades. Stephen co-leads the Hoover History Lab, and his research encompasses geopolitics and authoritarian regimes in history and present day. Thank you, Stephen, for moderating today's discussion. I'll turn it over to you to introduce today's guest.
Thank you, Erin. It's great to be here, and I have the great honor to introduce my good friend and colleague, General HR. I woke up early this morning at 5:30 to begin rereading his biography, and I didn't finish, and those were just the highlights. HR McMaster is the Fuad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow here at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, among many other distinguished affiliations. He was on track to become a globally renowned rugby player, but he gave up the fame and glory of sport to enter public service. After graduating from the U.S. Military Academy, he earned a PhD in military history from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He currently serves as chairman of the War Studies Department at West Point alongside his Hoover appointment. General McMaster spent 34 years in the U.S. Army, and he served in command positions, leading our forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. He wrote what remains an indispensable book on the Vietnam War, Dereliction of Duty, whose lessons have only increased over time. He served as National Security Advisor to President Trump during his first term and wrote another indispensable book about that tour of duty in government. He is an accomplished impersonator, but he chooses only to impersonate very obscure subjects, which is perhaps why this remarkable talent of his is not better known. He hosts an important and timely podcast at Hoover called Battlegrounds, which is also the title of yet another book of his, and which should help inform today's webinar on developing strategic culture for our next generation leaders. General HR, over to you. I'm thrilled to be here with you.
Hey, Stephen. Hey, it's great to be with you. Somebody who I admire, and I'm so grateful to be your friend and your neighbor up there in the Hoover Tower. But I've learned so much from you over the years, and what I'm hoping is this will be a conversation where both of us will contribute to the answer to this question of how do we restore our strategic competence and therefore confidence, right? Confidence in our institutions of government and the ability of those institutions to achieve good outcomes for the American people. Because I think we really do have a dearth of confidence these days, Stephen, where we really don't have faith that our government can advance our interests effectively abroad, whether in war or in competitions, short of war. And I think where that comes from, and I'll try to be like brief here, but is a neglect of history. I really, hashtag predictable for us two historians will probably agree on this, right? That it is ignorance of history, which I think oftentimes lends itself or creates the conditions for folly in foreign policy and in war. And in particular, I think the neglect of history and the associated atrophy in academia in terms of the ability to study diplomatic and military history in particular has led to a kind of prevalence of social science theories, which are useful and important to interdisciplinary study of war in the context of programs like a war studies program. But I think if you don't study history and instead you study these theories, that it creates kind of a veneer of understanding, and it encourages students, graduates to try to fit, these complex challenges that we're facing in the world into the theory, instead of, as we learn as historians, ask the question, what is the nature of the challenge associated with the Chinese Communist Party? And then be sensitive to the complex causality of events, which is what history really helps you gain, is that kind of sensitivity. And I believe also that the study of history is an exercise in humility, because you can see how others, smart people typically confronted difficult challenges and oftentimes fell short, because of maybe sometimes the intractability of problems, the limits of agency that we often have over some of the complex challenges we're facing. So, I think the number one recommendation here that's consistent with this awesome program that we have at Hoover on revitalizing American institutions is to revitalize the study of diplomatic and military history in the academy, and to do so in a way that kind of eschews these postmodernist approaches to the study of history, and tries to understand historical events and trends on their own terms. So I think what I'd like to do is just really quickly my own experience in coming into the job of National Security Advisor quite unexpectedly, and how the study of history informed what we try to achieve for President Trump in the period 2017 to 2018. I cover this a little bit in the book, but in February of 2017, I'm walking down Walnut Street in my hometown of Philadelphia. Go Phillies! And as I'm on my way to brief out the study that we had done on Russian New Generation warfare, and my job at the time was to design the future army, we took an historical approach to that. We modeled our study of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and their broader campaign of what we're calling Russian New Generation warfare, of political subversion, the use of assassinations, cyber information warfare, cyber attacks, all those range of activities that Russia engages in to try to accomplish objectives below the threshold of what might elicit a concerted response to this Russian aggression. And we modeled this study off the study that General Don Starry had done of the 1967 war in Israeli-Arab War in 1967. And he brought an interdisciplinary team to try to distill out of that experience the lessons that were important to the development of the future army. So we put this interdisciplinary team together, and then I was briefing out this study when on my way to brief it out, when my phone rang and said, "Hey, will you come to Mar-a-Lago and interview for the job as National Security Advisor?" Well, as I was reflecting on, well, am I up for this job? I thought about my previous experiences in the Army, but what I was most grateful for, Stephen, was the opportunity to read, study, research, and write history at the University of North Carolina in my master's and PhD program there. And the question I took on was, how wide did Vietnam become an American war, and what were the roles of President Lyndon Johnson's principal civilian and military advisors in the decisions that led to an American war in Vietnam, mainly between Kennedy's assassination and the No Diem coup and the July 65 decisions. And in the process of writing that dissertation, which became a book, I became a student of the national security decision-making process in the post-World War II period. And then at West Point, had the opportunity to teach a survey course, 2 semesters of military history, and a course called the history of the Korean and Vietnam Wars. And what this, I think, allowed me to gain an appreciation for were how different presidents made decisions, how they structured their decision-making processes, what the various roles and how the roles were similar and different between various national security advisors. And so when I get hired on President's Day, Monday at Mar-a-Lago, fly to Washington, didn't live in Washington, but start work the next day in the White House, I took out a legal pad and just wrote down what I thought were the 5 main lessons of Vietnam War decision-making. And the first of these were, take more time to think about the nature of the challenges we're facing. And this is where history and the academy can equip students to think holistically about complex challenges to security or vital interests. The second of these was that it's really important to have a clear goal and objective in mind and to take time crafting it. You might think, well, that sounds kind of obvious, but McGeorge Bundy had concluded in this period of time that I was studying that it's better not to have an objective in Vietnam because that way, if the president doesn't accomplish it, it will give him more flexibility in the domestic political arena. The third key lesson was, and this is a lesson you can also glean from Peter Rodman's great book, Presidential Command, that it's important to give a president multiple options because, hey, the president's the person who got elected, but it's really in the comparison of these courses of action, these options, you can draw out long-term costs and consequences and risk and mitigation and so forth. The fourth key lesson, and this is what's really important, and I think where the study of history is immensely important, is to make explicit any assumptions that are underpinning your planning efforts. My experience has been, Stephen, that 90% of the problem with flawed U.S. policies and strategies is implicit assumptions that are fundamentally flawed, but because they're implicit, they never get challenged. Pakistan, if we're nice to Pakistan, right, and we have sustained aid to them, they're going to really cut off their assistance, for jihadist terrorist organizations and help us with, the Al-Qaeda and Taliban problem. Well, how did that work out? China, if China's welcomed into the international order, China will play by the rules, and as China prospers, guess what? They'll become just like us. The CCP will liberalize its economy and liberalize its form of governance. How did that one work out? Vladimir Putin, what he really needs is he needs his security concerns allayed, and then everything will be okay. And so these are the kinds of assumptions that underpin policies across multiple administrations, right? And then finally, I kind of alluded to this already. It's really important to try to insulate policymaking processes from what can distract you from your purpose, and in particular, partisan political considerations. Because Lyndon Johnson really, he saw Vietnam principally as a danger to his goals of getting elected in 1964 and passing the Great Society in 65. And what he didn't want to do is entertain any option that might jeopardize really support from constituencies on which that domestic agenda depended. So I'll just stop there. I wanted to just provide an illustration for us maybe now to have a conversation about, how do we invigorate the study of history? And I'd like to just ask you, what your thoughts are on the overall subject, as well as any reaction to that intro.
Yeah, it's great, General. If only we all had that yellow pad in front of us every day. We need to put that in the Hoover Library and Archives and get it up digitized on the website. Taking more time, having clear goals, multiple options, making explicit those assumptions, and insulating from the partisan politics. The irony of Johnson, of course, is everything was subordinated to partisan politics in decision-making in foreign policy, and it didn't work because he gave up running for re-election in the end, precisely because of some of the decision-making that you cover in your dereliction of duty book. So you think you're doing one thing, but you're doing the opposite in this perverse and unintended consequences kind of way. Talk a little bit for us about the difference between strategic and tactical. not just on the military battlefield where it's really, really critical, but also in this policy formation, decision-making process. You alluded to taking more time, having a clear goal. So I can already see a differentiation implicit there in strategic and tactical. Make that explicit for us following your own prescription.
Okay. Well, first of all, it's important to really just have in your own mind a working definition of strategy, right? Everybody wants a strategy for everything now, right? You want to buy a car. Well, I need a strategy to buy a car, and our colleague Hugh Strawn, one of the greatest, I think, military historians of his generation, if not the greatest, he kind of took the mantle, I think, from Michael Howard, in terms of just the most accomplished and insightful military historian. He said that the meaning of strategy has become banal, right? Because everybody wants a strategy for everything. I think what differentiates strategy from a plan is the complexity of the environment and competition, opposition, rivals, right? Because what that does is it creates a degree of uncertainty that means you can't just have a plan like to build a bridge or something, right? That that there are going to be unforeseen occurrences, circumstances you're going to have to react to. And so therefore you have to kind of elevate your perspective and come up with just a broader concept that does what, the Army taught me when I was a, lieutenant. The definition of strategy is a strategy is ends, ways, and means, beginning with what you want to achieve in the ends. Then the ways are very important. How? You have to answer the question, how do we get to that objective? And then you can determine from that the means that are necessary for you to be able to integrate all elements of national power and efforts of like-minded partners to accomplish the overall objective. And I think that's kind of the essence of strategic competence, is your ability, to actually understand complex problems, to visualize, right, how you get from where you are today to the accomplishment of your ends. And what happens a lot of times, Stephen, is that, like, if there's not a strategy, people substitute tactics for the strategy, and they tend to then centralize decision making. When I first got into the job as National Security Advisor, I said, "Hey, please give me a list of all of the authorities and decisions that have been centralized at the White House level, the president's level, away from the departments and agencies." The list was really long and made no sense to me. Like, anytime we're going to sail naval vessels through the South China Sea, you had to get permission. I'm like, hey, last time I checked, China doesn't own the ocean. Why are we doing that? Or we can only have 3 Apache helicopters in Syria at any one time. Well, why is that? So I think what both of those examples reflect is that we did not have a strategy in place to deny China's claim that they own the South China Sea, right? We didn't have a strategy in place to accelerate the defeat of ISIS, ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS, and then have some kind of a vision about how we could incentivize over time a resolution of the Syrian civil war. And so if you don't have a strategy for that, then what you do is you begin to centralize decisions because you want control, right? If you have a good strategy in place, a good strategy should help make you feel comfortable with relinquishing control and allow you to allow support organizations, departments, agencies, support to the president to take initiative, and to implement that strategy.
Empowering others. Why appoint good people if you don't empower them to do their job?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Talk a little bit about sometimes what I call junk history. So it's clear that some of us don't know enough of history.
Yeah.
That's, of course, on us educators. When we complain that people don't know history, it's not their fault. It's our fault to be better educators, to make it more interesting, to show its relevance in their decision-making, in their own strategies. I see a lot of history that I would call junk history. And sometimes the junk history is worse than complete ignorance of history. So, for example, in the case of China, there was an historical theory that we did this with Germany, we did this with Japan, we did it with South Korea and Taiwan, so we know how to do this. That is to say, if you engage and they liberalize their economy, they can also begin to approach the kind of politics of a classical constitutional order with rule of law. And so we know this playbook from those other cases. The problem is that playbook didn't apply to the Eurasian landmass empires, who had a different history. The case of China, the case of Russia, the case of Iran, right? For them, they predate the existence of the United States by at least a millennium. And in some cases, in the China case, more than that. And they have their own sense of how international order should look and what their trajectory might be. And so we had an historical playbook that we were applying, but it wasn't the history that I myself would have chosen for the Eurasian landmass empires. And also when we have all the analogies at hand, Munich, Vietnam, and I could go on, you know this well, when people throw these analogies around it. So talk a little bit, not just about ignorance of history, but about the junk history that either people got wrong or they're applying in the wrong cases.
Right. Junk history, or you might say drunk history. I don't know if you've ever seen that Comedy Central show, Drunk History, where they typically have grad students in history over imbibe and then give their version of the Napoleonic Wars or something. I mean, it's pretty amusing. But
but hey, unfortunately, a lot of people don't need to get drunk to give us that drunk history.
That's right. So I really like David Hackett Fisher's book on how history can help you inform decision making, because it's so comprehensive. It's kind of dense, it's not really accessible for just general readers. But I think he did a very good job of laying out the application of history, the importance of thinking in time and reasoning by historical analogy, but also pointing out the deficiencies. And of course, Margaret Macmillan's much more accessible short book called Dangerous Games is also very good. There are some other monographs, I forget the author's name, darn it. I think it was a Columbia history professor, called Analogies at War, about the Vietnam War and the overuse of the Munich analogy and so forth. So there's a good literature out there, which is actually, I think, a great course to teach, in grad school, is what Michael Howard called in this great essay, which I always assign to whatever class I teach, the use and abuse of military history, which gets to this point as well. So you're right. I mean, there are many people who misuse, abuse history, make the wrong historical analogies, especially, I experienced this, and Stephen, in Iraq and Afghanistan, with, the failed efforts to kind of build institutions there and to transition into a form of governance to replace kind of the authoritarian, the theocratic dictatorship in Afghanistan, or, the Ba'ath Party dictatorship in Iraq. And I led a couple of efforts, which again, I think are illustrative of the importance of history, to try to correct some of those deficiencies. One of those was to help rewrite the campaign plan during the surge in Iraq in 2007. And I brought, an interdisciplinary effort together. Stephen Biddle, who is one of the most accomplished, social scientists who thinks clearly about war. I mean, I kind of liken him to Dr. Spock. Everything he says is logical. He's a great thinker. But then we brought a historian named Toby Dodge, who you might know, who's a historian of Iraq and specialized in institutional history in Iraq, which was very important to understand, really, how to help the Iraqis establish, effective governance, for example, or rule of law, and to rebuild these institutions that have been really kind of destroyed by Saddam because they were turned into, to his purpose and reflected his megalomania and brutality. So I think that understanding the full complexity is what's important. People, of course, they grasp for facile analogies to oftentimes shop around for the history that will support their what they want to do, and that's always dangerous, right? It's like a pilot shopping for weather. Hey, if the weather's bad, you don't want to fly. And so I think we have to be on guard about this. But this is what we could teach students too, right? Is how to reason by historical analogy while being cognizant of the potential pitfalls of doing so, and provide them with examples, and and then help them help them identify their own examples of as Michael Howard called it the use and abuse of history. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. How do you think about what history can and can't do, or shouldn't do, try to do?
I think it's really important to practice the scientific method. I mean, that sounds banal and it's a cliche, but for me, the scientific method is actively seeking evidence that disproves your hypothesis, that disproves what you want to believe, that disproves that you're sure what is right. And so it might well be that you don't find evidence that disproves what you want to believe, and therefore it is true. But if you're not actively seeking evidence to contradict your hypothesis or your cherished beliefs, really your convictions, what you want to be true, if you're not actively doing that, you're not seeking the scientific method. So if you go out there proactively trying to disprove yourself, you get to a much better place. Now, it may well be that the evidence is contradictory, the evidence is hard to read, the evidence is insufficient. It's not always the case that we have a preponderance of evidence on all the questions that are before us. Mm-hmm. You talked about humility, and it's really important, for sure, history teaching humility. But I think this proactive seeking of evidence that might be contrary to our hunch or to our cherished beliefs, that's something that I found. I didn't have that when I was young. I was quite eager to prove what it is that I wanted to be true. Yeah. And it took me some time in a PhD student to develop this and to carry that forward. But it's been with me ever since. And I really feel that if we do that at a minimum, we go really far.
I'd like to give an example of your work on this. Your book, Uncivil Society, challenged what had become the conventional wisdom, right, about the collapse of dictatorships in Eastern Europe, the collapse of the Soviet Union, right, and a lot of that was had become kind of the foundation for the way we viewed the world and the post Cold War world, right, and so I think that's just such a great point, is to don't accept the conventional wisdom. Sometimes you can guard against that by, I think, bringing people in with different perspectives, yes, and consulting others, asking them to, murder board or to red team, whatever you're working on.
Explain a little bit for our viewers what red team, we don't always practice red team in academia, or what a murder board is. Tell us a little bit more about those practices.
So a red team would be that, you subject whatever you think your plan is, or the assumptions that underpin your plan, to others who would view them skeptically. Oftentimes a red team is looks at the same challenge you're facing from the perspective of your adversary, right? And so there's a good literature on this, but I think a book that is really important to kind of red teaming yourself, or giving entertain the perspective of others, is called A Sense of the Enemy by our colleague and a visiting fellow here named Zachary Shore.
Yes.
Also, I'm very taken with his other book called Blunder, Why Smart People Make Bad Decisions. And what he does is he in each of those chapters, he tells us his historical vignette up front that illuminates, this cognitive trap that you could fall into. And so I think that it's also important, to understand, this is, understand like what you don't know about a situation, or what might be like unknowable about it, and I'm thinking of when I interviewed General Goodpaster, who I think is, kind of one of the unsung heroes of the post World War II period, a really clear thinker from a strategic perspective, became President Eisenhower's right-hand man in establishing the Eisenhower National Security Council, and then later became superintendent of West Point. Took a demotion after he was the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, because West Point was having difficulty integrating women, and they needed somebody of his stature. Just a fantastic guy. But I interviewed him on the Vietnam book. He said they didn't know what they didn't know, talking about Robert McNamara and others. And I think, again, as you've already highlighted, studying history should give you a sense of humility. Whenever you think you know the answer, and there's some great examples of military history, right? Of military officers who thought they had the answer. I'm thinking about the French Army offensive in 1917 that breaks the army and ends in mutiny, right? Whenever you have a general who says, I have the solution, you should start looking for the exit.
Problems are always more complex than we'd like them to be, but you don't always have full information in real time. Historians, we look back at our cases and we have a lot of information from many different points of view. Decision makers in the moment, and especially people looking forward, hoping for some strategic decision that has positive consequences, not just today, but evolving over time. There's a lot of uncertainty that you're dealing with in those moments. Henry Kissinger, in some ways, made a career out of discussing the difficulty of decision making under uncertainty. You can't avoid the decision. The problems are immediate. You can't have the full information. So whether on the battlefield, life or death decisions, right, in the White House, where the decisions are not always immediate life and death, but can be. Right. How does one deal with the uncertainty stuff that you're mentioning? Not just failing to understand what we don't know, but lacking critical data and input, but you can't wait for it to come in.
Well, this is a really great topic. Thank you for raising it, because I do think that, to be effective as a military commander in particular, you have to be comfortable with uncertainty. And I think when military commanders get into difficulties is when they want certainty before they make a decision. And that's a recipe for losing the initiative, for delaying decisions. Karl von Clausewitz, who all of us washed up generals have to quote as frequently as possible. He's actually brilliant. He said, having taken into consideration everything that you can learn about a situation, you must march boldly forth into the shadows of uncertainty. And I think what has gotten us off track oftentimes as we're developing future force capabilities is we make the assumption that emerging technologies have shifted war fundamentally from the realm of uncertainty to the realm of certainty. This was the problem associated with kind of strategic bombing, theory in the 1920s. It was the problem associated with the orthodoxy of the revolution in military affairs in the 1990s, which was in a lot of ways, I think, a setup for the difficulties that we encountered in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's coming back. This is what I called in an essay years ago, the vampire fallacy, because you can't kill it. And now it's AI, related technologies and supercomputing that really this time is going to shift war into the realm of certainty. And then once you make that assumption, right, war's going to be certain. Well, guess what's most important after that? Well, then you're going to have the perfect plan, perfect information, perfect plan. If you have the perfect plan, what you want to do is centralize authority. You don't want anybody doing their own stuff. You want them to execute that perfect plan. And then if you're centralizing all of that, what's most important is synchronization, not initiative. And you can see how you can create a culture also that expects certainty. And then you now have a cultural deficiency in your military. You've been optimized for certainty. It's a disaster. So this is, I'm thinking of Robert Doty's great book, The Breaking Point on Sedan, and then also The Seeds of Disaster, kind of a companion volume, where he compares and contrasts French doctrine and German doctrine in 1940. And the fundamental assumption was the French commanders would be what they called at the handle of the fan in these bunkers, because, hey, the telegraph and wire communications, it shifted war to the realm of certainty, So we've been down this path so much. And this is where I think history can help inform us in a way that it helps us avoid pitfalls, right? I'll give you a couple other examples. I think studying battle is really important, so you understand the nature of battle, because that hasn't really changed a whole heck of a lot. I mean, John Keegan in the book, The Face of Battle, which I love this book because it shows the importance of what Sir Michael Howard advocated, which is studying warfare in width, right? He says you study warfare in width, depth, and context. And so this is warfare across, I think it was like 5 centuries, wasn't it, Stephen? I think 5 centuries or 4 centuries in the same geographic spot in Belgium. And then he explores, how technology evolved the character of warfare. But in the end, And there's a great paragraph in the end of The Face of Battle where it says, what battles have in common is human. The struggle of men and, of course, women now, struggling to reconcile their instinct for self-preservation with the achievement of some aim over which others are trying to kill him. And then he says, what battle ultimately is it's aimed at the disintegration of human groups. I read that when I was a lieutenant. And you know what I thought? I'm going to make sure my human group never disintegrates. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to build confidence as a bulwark against fear and disintegration. And whereas you might focus on specific tactics, techniques, knowledge, skills, and abilities of soldiers as you're training, I always had that in mind. I'm instilling confidence to make sure we can disintegrate our enemies in battle, but they can't disintegrate us, And so it's those kinds of conclusions that shape your thinking that I think are so important associated with the study of history. Otherwise, you would do what you would do as a junior officer, right? You would do your gunnery and maneuver exercises and training, but you wouldn't have that context of what are we really trying to achieve?
We often focus on territory, territorial gains and losses. You're talking about the will to fight and the capacity to fight, and maintaining one's own and attacking the enemy's will to fight and capacity to fight. There's a lot of stuff in there. There's the decision-making loop and many other aspects that are important. But fundamentally, whether you lose territory or you hold territory, you have to hold your will and capacity to fight, and you have to disintegrate the opponent's will and capacity to fight. That's sort of what the nub of the gist of what you're getting at.
Absolutely. Which is like continuity in war, right? And so, Carl Becker, one of my favorite historians, who had that great essay, Every Man a Historian, he said that that memory of past and anticipation of future should walk hand in hand in a happy way. And I think what happens oftentimes was when you neglect continuity, you focus exclusively on change,
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it was the changes in technology that created problems for us in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was neglect of continuities in the nature of war's political and human dimensions.
Yeah. We're getting some really good questions in the chat here about whether wars are winnable anymore and how we go about fighting and winning wars. People are talking about the experiences that you had firsthand, Afghanistan and Iraq. Explain to us a little bit about the nature of war and your understanding of victory, as well as winning the peace, not only winning the war. Really big subject, but I can't think of a better guy.
Well, I think we had these fundamentally flawed assumptions about the nature of those wars, and again, and I've written about this in Battlegrounds and in the War with Ourselves, but these flawed assumptions about the nature of the post-Cold War world were a setup, I think, for the difficulties in Iraq and Afghanistan. And those assumptions were that, hey, an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. That great power competition was a relic of the past, but then most importantly, that our technological military prowess, as demonstrated in the Gulf War, would make future wars fast, cheap, and efficient. And we would essentially be able to take, what I would call the George Costanza approach to war and just leave on a high note. And so we forgot that, hey, the consolidation of gains has never been an optional phase in war. You don't have to do the consolidation of gains if you're doing a military raid, which is a military operation of limited purpose, short duration, and planned withdrawal. But if it's a war, you've got to get to a sustainable political outcome consistent with what brought you into that war to begin with. There's a great book on this by another one of our colleagues, Nadia Shadlow, called War and the Art of Governance. And I recommend that last chapter for anybody who wants to understand the failure to consolidate gains in Iraq and Afghanistan. What I saw in both wars, close up, in both wars, was nobody wanted to do it. It was the consolidation of gains. Some historians knew it had to be done. A guy named Conrad Crane, who's a fantastic military historian, put out this pamphlet in 2003, right before we invaded Iraq. And he was like, hey, United States Army, you're going to have to do all these tasks. This is what you've had to do in Panama, Dominican Republic. I would give any example. Civil War reconstruction. You always have had to do this. But nobody wanted to do it. Again, to your point earlier, Stephen, in large measure because we learned the wrong lessons from Vietnam. One of the lessons from the Gulf War, the lesson from Vietnam was we're not going to do that anymore, right? We're just going to leave when it's done. General Tommy Franks, after the invasion of Iraq, he went around to every unit. He was saying, take as much risk getting out as you did coming in. So what happened, I believe, is that both these wars were winnable. I mean, we haven't lost yet in Iraq still. I mean, that's still up for, we'll see how that goes. But, I think the short-term approach to what were long-term problems in both places lengthened those wars and made them more costly. And so I've written more about this in other places to explain that kind of interpretation. But it was mainly based on, I think that war, let's just take Iraq, for example.
Yes.
Stage one, ignorance of what it would take to consolidate. I think this was willful ignorance in a lot of ways, right? We're just not going to do that. And we're going to have the State Department do it. Well, hey, there's no State Department cavalry. They don't exist. They've never existed, right? Then we went into denial. I had the opportunity to write many memos for the Central Command Commander, General Abizaid, who also used to have a Hoover affiliation, fantastic guy, to Secretary Roosevelt. Hey, we got an insurgency here. He's like, no, don't say the I word. Don't say insurgency. And so we had this denial period. And then we had a period where, in that period of denial, we just wanted to get the hell out. And then finally, we had an adaptation period as a sectarian civil war had morphed onto an insurgency that had coalesced and gotten stronger. So I could go on about this. Then we won. I think we won that war, Stephen. And I know it's kind of maybe predictable for somebody who was involved emotionally and lost 63 of our cavalry troopers in combat in Iraq to say we won. But I'll tell you, Stephen, in 2010. Baghdad was safer than any major U.S. city, and the insurgency was defeated. And then what happened is we disengaged, not only militarily, but diplomatically, as the Iranians pulled a fast one through the election to Maliki, who then put back into place sectarian policy. I could go on. Okay. I'll just say, consolidation of gains was neglected both places, and as a result, we took a short-term approach to long-term problem sets, and those wars got longer and more costly. And then our will was diminished because the American people lost confidence. And I think our presidential leaders too. I don't think what the American people need to know about a war is what is at stake?
Yes.
And what is a strategy that will deliver a favorable outcome at an acceptable cost and risk? And I think our presidential leaders did a poor job of explaining that in both those wars.
People are asking about not just the consolidation of gains once you're in the war, but the rationale for going into the war in the first place.
Yeah.
In other words, once you're in, 100% clear, you got to be in to win.
Yeah.
You're not in a war to lose a war, or else you're irresponsible. But should you go in the first place? How do we make those decisions as a republic? One of the key points you brought up at the outset, giving the president multiple options, right? And so, and you lived by that when you were in that office. And we can see it in your book, At War with Ourselves, from the time that you were in there. You tell quite a number of stories of setting up a process for multiple options, and then the president who's elected makes the decision, and others get in line and implement, right? That's really important understanding. But what about the decision for war in the first place?
Well, this is a great question. Again, history here, invaluable, right? As Hustron and other historians have pointed out, wars oftentimes turn into another whole different kind of war. Right. I mean, they don't end the way that they started oftentimes. And that's because of the interactive nature of war. Right. War's political, war's human, war's uncertain, because it is what Clausewitz called the continuous interaction of opposites, which means there's no such thing as linear progress in war ever. And so at the outset of a war, or when you're making a decision whether or not to use military force and to enter into a war or an armed conflict, you have to consider that the future course of events depends not just on us, but on enemies who have authorship over the future as well. And so I think that's kind of a macro level observation. But then you should try to, as best as you can, identify the long-term costs and potential long-term costs and risks. This was the problem in Vietnam, and I wrote about this pretty extensively in Dereliction of Duty, is that there was a tendency just to really consider each step up the ladder. And for Lyndon Johnson, in retrospect, it looks like, wow, I guess he really wanted to get us into that to become an American war. No, he wanted the opposite. But because he was unwilling to entertain the potential long-term costs and consequences, he never really considered them and wanted to continue to avoid making a tough decision. So, I think what's important to highlight is not only the risk and cost of action, but the risk and cost of inaction, but also to recognize you're going to make mistakes, right? And you might go against whatever your doctrine was. I mean, heck, we had drawn the Korean Peninsula, was outside of our sphere of vital interest that we had identified just a year earlier, before the June 1950 invasion, right? We had withdrawn all of our troops because we thought it wasn't that important to us. But President Truman had like a different idea, right? And thank God for everybody who lives south of the 38th parallel, right? That he had that idea. Whoever thought we were going to go to war in Afghanistan, right? I mean, our track record, as Secretary Bob Gates has pointed out, in predicting the next war is perfect because it's zero, And so again, this is where I think as you face these kinds of decisions about whether or not to go to war, and this is where Secretary Rice, our director here at Hoover, has great insights because of the post 9/11 period. The key is to try to anticipate, what are the long-term costs and consequences, and to always balance the risk of action, which you ought to be clear-eyed about as best you can, with the risk and cost of inaction.
Yeah, that's the hardest one.
Well, and this is another book. Oh, another book to recommend is Don Kagan's book on the origins of war and prospects for peace. Great on this topic, I think.
Yes, this is now becoming like a PhD seminar, our reading list. It's like about 500 or 700 pages a week here.
Don Higginbotham was one of my advisors at UNC Chapel Hill, and after I took the written exam, he said, "Congratulations, HR, you now know more history than you will ever know." And I think that's true.
Well, sometimes we forget things we knew, but it's important to learn them in the first place because you don't forget everything. We're getting a lot of good questions about Ukraine, Russia, and some about China. So in the time we have remaining, you could maybe apply some of your analytical acumen, your historical background, not to where we were on Russia, Ukraine, but where we could be or should be. We have some really consequential decisions in the administration right now. The players personally on this. You're in contact with some of them. Give us a little bit on your analysis of Russia, Ukraine, policy-wise, options for the president. And then if we have time, we'll do the China piece in conclusion.
Okay, I'll do Russia really fast because I want to hear what you think about this, and anybody who's on this webinar should want to hear more from you on it than me. And so I would just say that we made some big mistakes on not being able to deter Russia's attack in the first place. Those were based on flawed assumptions about what drives and constrains Vladimir Putin. Again, this is an argument for strategic empathy. Multiple presidents, all through President Biden, maybe President Trump again, believe that Putin just really needs his security concerns allayed, and they don't recognize the degree to which he is obsessed with restoring Russia to national greatness, and by doing so, really by pursuing some sort of a restoration, a revanchist agenda associated with restoring the Russian Empire to a certain degree, or at least creating servile relationships among countries that would fall into his sphere of influence. And he wants to extinguish Ukrainian sovereignty as part of that. So if you understand the nature of the problems that we're mentioning about, and you make your assumptions explicit, I think the assumption is Putin won't stop until he is stopped, until he's convinced that he's losing the war. And the way to convince him that he's losing the war is to impose greater costs on an economy that's failing, but also to communicate long-term support for Ukraine, maybe in connection with a long-term low-interest loan that could allow the Ukrainians to buy weapons from us, and expand our industrial base. in terms of this framework that I offered, what should the objective be? It should be a free, sovereign, secure Ukraine, whatever you can salvage of Ukraine out of a ceasefire and agreement that can defend itself, right? And can get on the path to restoring its sovereignty and its prosperity. And of course, there are risks associated with this that you have to mitigate. But I mean, that's the way I think about it. And I'd love to hear what you think. What you think, and maybe also about the future of Russia, because Stephen, you've got that great essay on the 5 alternative futures for Russia.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand what you're saying is Putin is playing for the win. He doesn't want to draw. He's not playing for a draw. He's playing for not just territory in Ukraine, some of which he doesn't even control yet, but subordination of Kiev to himself, to Moscow, to the Kremlin, and then eviction of U.S. power from Europe, or certainly the extension of U.S. power post-91, when the former Soviet satellites or republics begged to join the Western Alliance, and we agreed to accept them into our. He's playing for keeps. He wants to win, not to draw. Ukraine should have been, and is now, playing for a draw. They, for a while, were playing for a win, but that was sort of beyond the circumstances, in my view, and I was arguing that 3 years ago. We needed a draw. And a draw was a very good outcome for Ukraine, sort of like the Korean Peninsula that you were alluding to, where whatever territory Ukraine can control, they should control it fully, not partially, which is what Putin is trying to impose. And it should be reconstructed in a modernist fashion, not rebuilding the stuff that was there, the early 20th century economy that was bequeathed to Ukraine from the Soviet Union. Yeah. So playing for a draw is a version of a win for Ukraine. But getting that across was really difficult during the heady days of planning this offensive and that offensive. So now the game is getting Putin to accept that draw, to make him climb down from playing for all marbles here, playing for the win. And he'll do that if his regime is at stake. However many soldiers he loses on the battlefield, he'll just send more to their deaths. However many points we shave off his GDP, he'll impose austerity on other people, not on himself and his elites. His pain point is political. It's about the survival of his regime politically. And so if that is put at risk, both covertly and overtly, and his attention is clear that it's either agree to a draw on terms that are more favorable to Ukraine than the ones he's demanding now, or risk losing your regime, it's 100% clear to me he is going to take regime survival over that. We have not applied that political pressure. We've said it was escalatory. We've applied the pressure on the battlefield, a war of attrition, a larger country against a smaller country, and a larger country that doesn't care about loss of life. That's a hard war of attrition against a country like Russia is hard for anybody, despite Ukraine's courage and ingenuity. We've applied it in the economic sphere, but not as well on the price of oil, which is the most significant pain point by far for him. Nor can we successfully blockade Eurasia to prohibit smuggling and third parties and cutouts delivering all sorts of contraband for his war effort, let alone directly from China. But we've been playing in the economic space, we've been playing in the military space, we've been ramping up the pressure, and in the political space, the pressure has been minimal or next to nothing. Now, of course, he took a really big political blow in Syria, and you were advocating movement on the Syrian front for some time. That was not us, that was really Turkey and other aspects in the Middle East involving Israel. But you could see where that was a really big blow to him, the Syria one. Again, not something we did, but something we can benefit from. And there are other points of vulnerability that you know well from being on the inside. So that's what I see the move going forward. As far as the future of Russia, very briefly, our goal should be a free and a democratic Russia ultimately, but that's going to be very hard to do since it really hasn't been the norm there. So in the meantime, we need a Russia that may be nationalistic, but retrenches from aggression abroad. Not because they love Ukraine or any of their other neighbors, but because they fear the cost for Russia of an aggressive policy abroad. So they're Russian patriots who want to pull back for the sake of Russia. And that's our constituency that we have to play to. They may not be Thomas Jefferson. They may not share our values. They may, in fact, despise America. But they understand American power. They understand the self-defeating trajectory of Russia currently. And so deconflating Russian elites and the Putin regime, peeling off patriotic Russians who, again, may not be favorably disposed towards Ukraine, no altruism, but are hurting for Russia and therefore think that the war is hurting Russia and should be stopped in the draw that's more favorable to Ukraine. So that's how I see our strategic options there. I'm not sure I've been getting through with that message very successfully now for the 3 years, but I've been pretty consistent on that message.
Well, I hope you get through. I mean, it's a critical moment. Thanks, Stephen. That's awesome. It's great.
It's a great conversation. We'll have to reserve the China piece for the next one, although people can go online and on YouTube and all of your amazing podcasts with all sorts of really high-level policymakers and discussions of China, and not only China, on the Battlegrounds podcast, as well as the other Hoover programming on China with Rich on our YouTube channel. But I'd like to thank the audience for the excellent questions. And of course, I'd like to thank our general for the lucidity and the learning that he displayed. A lifelong learner. He's referring to books and concepts he's absorbed recently, not just when he was a student. And that's a really big lesson for everybody to learn, that you're not done with learning when you're in college, but it's a lifelong process, and you should never stop. I'm going to, at this point, turn it back to our host.
Prior to Stephen, I'm in the best learning environment because I get to learn from amazing scholars like you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you.
It's mutual, sir, and we'll do more. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, HR. We really appreciate your time. This recording will be available on the Hoover event webpage in the next 3 to 4 days. And that is also where you can find each of the individual webinars for this series. The events team will include a link to that chat that you can find. And we really encourage you to visit the series webpage to sign up for other sessions that we have, access to our recordings of previous webinars, and subscribe to our RAI newsletter to receive updates on the upcoming events. And thank you again for joining, and have a great day.